They were told Americans would torture them with fire and knives. Instead, they got bacon for breakfast, real coffee, and an invitation to Christmas dinner with the officers who fought their army. What happened next would shatter everything 12,000 German soldiers believed about their enemies and change the course of one young man's entire life. November 1944, the transport train lurched to a stop at Trinidad Station, and William Becker stepped onto frozen Colorado ground for the first time. He was 19 years old. The platform was wooden covered in frost that crunched under his boots with each careful step. The sound was sharp and brittle in the thin mountain air. Behind him, 8,500 German prisoners shuffled through the processing gates in a long, weary column. The cold hit him like a physical blow. 15 degrees Fahrenheit. His breath came out in white clouds that hung in the still air before dissipating. The Rocky Mountains towered to the west, their peaks white with early snow, alien and beautiful and utterly foreign. William had never seen mountains like these. They made the Alps look gentle. Metal handcuffs bit into his wrists. The steel was so cold it burned his skin. He could hear the sounds all around him, boots crunching on frozen gravel, slow and rhythmic, the hiss of steam from the train engine, the low murmur of German voices, exhausted and afraid, and above it all, the snap of an American flag in the wind. Red, white, blue, vivid against the gray winter sky. William looked at that flag and felt his stomach clench with fear. He had been taught for 9 years what to expect from Americans. 9 years of Hitler Youth meetings, of propaganda films, of officers' briefings. The message was always the same. Americans were savages, criminals, a mongrel race of mixed blood descended from European degenerates who had been cast out and sent to a wilderness. They had no culture, no honor, no humanity. If they captured you, they would torture you. They would starve you. They would ignore the Geneva Convention and treat you worse than animals. Better to die fighting than surrender to barbarians like these. William had believed every word. Everyone did. His teachers believed it. His officers believed it. His parents believed it. Why wouldn't he? But now, shuffling forward in that long line of prisoners, William noticed something that made no sense. The American guards processing them were professional, calm, not brutal. They checked names on clipboards. They assigned barracks numbers. They explained camp rules in clear, simple German through translators. Nobody was beaten. Nobody was tortured. The guards weren't even particularly angry. William waited for the real treatment to begin. He was born in Munich in 1925. A good Bavarian family. His father had fought in the First War and survived it. His mother kept a clean house and cooked Sunday dinners that filled their apartment with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread. His little sister Greta was 12 when William left for war. Blonde braids and gap-toothed smile, and a laugh that sounded like bells. That was before the uniforms and the marching and the speeches, before Normandy, before the Atlantic crossing and the cramped Liberty ship packed below deck, with 500 other captured soldiers vomiting and praying and wondering what fate waited on the other side of the ocean. 3 months ago, a lifetime ago. William remembered the briefing before D-Day. June 1940, the SS officer stood at the front of the tent with propaganda leaflets in his hands. He held them up for everyone to see. The drawings showed torture chambers, American soldiers with cruel faces doing unspeakable things to German prisoners. The officer's voice was certain and strong. If the Americans capture you, they will not follow the rules of war. They are not civilized people. They are criminals and savages. They will torture you for information and then kill you. Better to fight to the last bullet. Better to die with honor than fall into their hands. William believed him. They all did. But now, being processed into Camp Trinidad, William saw only efficiency, paperwork, organization. The Americans gave each prisoner 2 wool blankets, thick, clean, without lice. They gave them soap and towels. They assigned them to barracks and explained the daily schedule. Reveille at 6, breakfast at 7, work details if assigned, lights out at 10. It was so normal it was disturbing. The barracks surprised him most. He walked through the door expecting bare boards and freezing cold. Instead, he found rows of bunk beds and a coal stove in the center of the room already burning. The heat radiated outward. The temperature inside was maybe 65 degrees. Outside it was 15. The contrast made his head spin. William was assigned a bottom bunk. He set his small bag of belongings on the thin mattress and just stood there processing what he was seeing. Real mattress, not bare boards. Two wool blankets actually thick enough to provide warmth. A pillow with a pillowcase. Sheets that would be changed weekly, the guard said. Changed weekly. The Wehrmacht barracks where he'd trained had been freezing, overcrowded, infested with lice. This prison was warmer than German military quarters had ever been. He didn't understand. That first evening they were called to the mess hall for dinner. William filed in with his barracks group, 200 men moving in tired silence. The long building was filled with steam, pouring from vents near the ceiling. The smell hit him before he saw anything else. Meat. Real meat. Bread. Coffee. His knees nearly buckled. The serving line was simple. Metal trays sliding on rails with that distinctive metallic scraping sound. An American cook stood behind the counter. He was civilian, maybe 50, with kind eyes and weathered hands. He looked at William without hatred or contempt. Just looked at him like he was a person. Then he served the food. William watched the ladle scoop up beef stew from the enormous pot. The liquid splashed into his bowl thick and rich. Steam rose. He could see chunks of actual beef potatoes, carrots, real vegetables. His hands shook as he moved down the line. Two thick slices of white bread. Soft, not the sawdust ersatz bread they'd been eating in Germany for the past year. Real wheat bread that compressed slightly when he touched it. Real butter, yellow and soft enough to spread. Coffee, black hot with that unmistakable smell of actual coffee beans, not the roasted grain substitute that passed for coffee back home. A fresh apple. William hadn't seen an apple in 2 years. He sat down at one of the long metal tables and stared at his tray. This single meal was probably 1,200 calories. The guard had said they would receive 3,200 calories per day. Total, William's family in Munich was surviving on 1,000 calories a day, and those rations were decreasing every month. His mother and sister were eating turnips and watery soup and bread made from sawdust. And he, a prisoner of war, an enemy soldier, was being fed better than civilians in his own country. William lifted the spoon. The stew was still hot. The first bite hit his tongue and he almost cried. Salt, fat, the rich, deep flavor of actual beef, the texture of tender meat melting in his mouth, heat spreading down his throat and into his stomach. He hadn't tasted anything like this since before the war, maybe not even then. Around him, 200 German prisoners were having the same experience, eating in stunned silence. Some men's hands shook. Some had tears in their eyes. Nobody spoke. They just ate because the food was real and abundant, and nothing like what they'd been promised. William thought about his mother standing in ration lines for 4 hours to get a pound of flour. He thought about Greta making bread from sawdust and water and hope. He thought about the Nazi propaganda that had promised him Americans were starving, that their mongrel system was collapsing, that Germany's superior race and superior economy would crush them easily. He thought about the lies. That first night in the barracks, William lay in his bunk and listened. The coal stove crackled and popped in the center of the room. Sharp snaps as the fuel caught and burned. Men breathing around him, some already snoring. The wind outside howled mournful and cold, but inside it was warm. The contrast was surreal. There was an electric light overhead, a single bulb. William had watched an American guard flip the switch when he entered, and the light came on. Just like that. Electricity that worked every time. In Munich, the power had been out more often than on for the past 6 months. Bombed power plants, sabotaged lines, a city in darkness. But here in this prison camp in Colorado, they had reliable electricity. The abundance was everywhere if you knew how to see it. William couldn't sleep. His mind kept circling back to the same questions. If Americans were barbarians, why was the treatment so humane? If Germany was winning the war, like the propaganda claimed, why did the enemy have such overwhelming abundance, while Germany faced desperate shortages? If the Nazi teachings about racial superiority were true, why did the evidence contradict it at every turn? The questions felt dangerous to even think. 2 weeks into his imprisonment, William cut his hand on barbed wire during a work detail. It was a deep gash across his palm, and by evening it was red and swollen with infection. He expected nothing. In the Wehrmacht, treatment for minor wounds was simple. Bite down on leather, drink some schnapps if it was available, and hope the infection didn't kill you. Medical supplies were scarce. Doctors were for officers. But the guard who noticed William's hand during evening inspection sent him to the camp hospital immediately. The building was clean. It smelled of antiseptic, that sharp chemical smell that meant actual medical care. William had never been in a facility like this. There were examination rooms with real equipment, a surgery with an X-ray machine, supplies stocked on metal shelves. The doctor was an American lieutenant, James Morrison, 35, with kind eyes and steady hands. He looked at William's infected cut and treated him like an actual patient, not an enemy to be processed. Morrison cleaned the wound first. The cold alcohol swab on William's skin made him flinch. Then came the injection, a numbing agent. William's eyes went wide, anesthesia, for a minor hand wound. In the German army, you got anesthesia if you were having a limb amputated, and even then only if the supply existed. But here this American doctor was giving him a numbing injection for 7 stitches. The needle pinched slightly, then numbness spread through William's palm. He felt pressure but no pain as Morrison cleaned the wound more thoroughly. The sting of iodine turned his skin orange-brown. Then came the stitches. 7 precise ones. William watched the needle go in and out of his flesh, feeling only gentle tugging. No pain, no agony, just careful professional medical treatment. Morrison wrapped the hand in a clean white bandage and gave William a small bottle of pills. Antibiotics, he explained in slow, clear English. Take 1 3 times daily with food. This will prevent infection. William managed to stammer out a thank you in his broken English. Morrison smiled. Just keep it clean and dry. Come back in a week so I can check the healing. A week later, William returned. Morrison unwrapped the bandage, examined the stitches, and nodded with satisfaction. Perfect. No infection. You took good care of it. He gave William extra bandages and a tube of antiseptic cream. In case you need it later. William left the hospital in a daze. An enemy doctor had shown more care for his well-being than German officers had ever shown for their own soldiers. In the Wehrmacht, soldiers were bullets, expendable. You used them until they were gone, then got more. But these Americans treated prisoners like human beings worth saving. It was another crack in the wall of everything he'd been taught. The camp held 12,500 German prisoners, and they were not united. 3 factions emerged in those first weeks, clear as battle lines. 20% were hardcore Nazis, about 2,500 men who remained absolutely loyal to Hitler and the Reich despite capture. They were led by Sergeant Kurt Volker, and William learned to fear that name quickly. Volker was 35, an Eastern Front veteran with an iron cross and dead eyes, tall with a scarred face and the kind of presence that made men step aside when he walked past. He commanded through fear and maintained a secret Nazi hierarchy within the camp. Late at night after the guards made their rounds, Volker would hold clandestine meetings in the bathroom stalls. Hitler salutes in the darkness, whispered reminders of duty to the Führer, and punishments for anyone who showed weakness. The punishment for thanking an American guard was a beating. The punishment for praising the food was a beating. The punishment for expressing any gratitude whatsoever was a beating. Volker's enforcers would wait until the guards were gone, then drag the offender to the latrine and teach him what happened to traitors. William saw it happen in week 3. A young prisoner, maybe 17, had thanked a guard for giving him an extra blanket when he was sick. That night, Volker's men dragged him to the bathroom and beat him unconscious. The next morning, the boy's face was purple and swollen, and he wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. The message was clear. Gratitude was weakness. Kindness was a trap. Anyone who forgot his duty to Germany would suffer. 60% of the prisoners were uncertain. The majority, about 7,500 men, were confused by the good treatment, but too afraid to speak openly about it. They noticed the contradictions. They felt the cognitive dissonance. But they stayed quiet, kept their heads down, and tried to survive without taking sides. William was part of this group, at least at first. 20% were secret doubters. Men who were beginning to question everything but didn't dare voice those doubts where Volker might hear. They whispered carefully to trusted friends. They shared observations in low voices, and their numbers grew daily as the contradictions between Nazi propaganda and American reality piled up like snowdrifts. William shared a barracks with all 3 factions. His bunk was in a bay with 12 men. 4 were Volker's loyalists, watching everyone constantly. 5 were uncertain like William. 3 were secret doubters who whispered when they thought it was safe. The atmosphere was tense and dangerous. One wrong word could get you beaten or worse. In week 4, Volker cornered William near the latrine after evening roll call. The big man moved with surprising speed, blocking William's path. His scarred face was inches away. "You've been quiet lately, Becker." Volker's voice was soft, which somehow made it more threatening. "I notice quiet ones. They're usually thinking thoughts that could get them hurt." William's heart hammered against his ribs. "No, Sergeant." "No," Volker's eyes were flat and cold. "You're not thinking dangerous thoughts, not wondering why the Americans feed us so well, not feeling grateful to the enemy. I'm loyal to Germany, Sergeant." Volker studied him for a long moment. "I hope so, because I would hate for anything to happen to you. These are dangerous times. Accidents happen. Men fall, they get hurt." He smiled without warmth. "You understand?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Good." Volker stepped aside. "Remember where your loyalty belongs." William hurried away on shaking legs. The threat was clear. Volker was watching him. Any sign of doubt, any expression of gratitude, any betrayal of Nazi ideology would be met with violence. The stakes weren't abstract anymore. They were life and death. In December, William was assigned to a work detail at a local ranch. 20 prisoners were taken by trucks to help with winter tasks under guard supervision. The rancher's name was Jack Henderson. 52 years old, weathered face, hands rough from decades of hard labor. He'd lost his son at Anzio, died fighting the German army in Italy. But when Henderson looked at William and the other young prisoners, his face showed no hatred, just weariness. The ranch was 500 acres of Colorado prairie, cattle operation. William's eyes widened at what he saw. 3 tractors sat in the equipment barn: International Harvester, John Deere, Farmall. In Germany, farmers were using horses and hand tools because fuel and machinery were impossible to get. But this American rancher had 3 tractors and seemed to take them for granted. 2 Ford trucks, one from 1940, one from 1942. Both in good condition, used daily. The German army barely had vehicles by late 1944, and this one rancher owned 2 trucks for personal use. A barn bigger than the entire street William had grown up on in Munich. Grain silos overflowing with wheat and corn, storage sheds packed with equipment. The scale of abundance was difficult to process. On the second day of work, Henderson had William help clean out a storage shed. They were moving sacks and organizing supplies when William found something that made his hands freeze. At least 20 pounds of flour in burlap sacks covered in green-gray mold. Ruined. Henderson glanced over and grimaced. Hell must have gotten damp somehow. Just throw it out." William stared at him. "Throw it out?" "Yeah." Henderson shrugged. "Not worth trying to salvage. I've got plenty more." Plenty more. This American was going to throw away 20 pounds of flour because it got moldy. In Munich, William's mother waited in ration lines for 4 hours to get a single pound of flour. His sister Greta made bread from sawdust mixed with water and hope. And this rancher was discarding more flour than William's entire family would see in a year, casually, like it was nothing. The comparison burned in William's chest. Later that morning, he watched Henderson feed the cattle. The rancher scooped whole grain corn from a bin and poured it into the feeding troughs. Pounds of it, twice daily. High-quality grain that German civilians would have killed for being fed to livestock to fatten them for market. William couldn't help himself. "This for the cows," Henderson nodded. "Yup, fattens them up good, makes the meat better quality." German civilians were eating turnips and grass soup while American cattle ate whole grain corn. The industrial and agricultural gap between the two nations was so vast it made William dizzy to contemplate. Everything the Nazi propaganda had taught him about American weakness and German superiority was revealed as lies by simple observation. At noon, Henderson's wife brought lunch to the workers in the field. William and the other prisoners sat in the winter sun and ate what she'd prepared: fried chicken. The skin was crispy and golden. When William bit into it, there was an audible crunch, the sound of batter shattering under his teeth. Then the explosion of flavor. Salt, fat, herbs, the rich taste of chicken meat. Juice ran down his chin. Biscuits came next, fluffy and white, soaked in real butter that melted into the bread. Sweet tea in glass jars with ice cubes that clinked when he lifted it to his lips. The cold sweetness was shocking after months of drinking lukewarm water. For dessert, there was apple pie. The smell of cinnamon hit him first, then the flaky crust that crackled when his fork cut through it, warm, filling with chunks of apple, the taste of sugar and spice in abundance. The portions were enormous. William couldn't finish everything on his plate. He stared at the leftover food and felt ashamed because back home people were starving, and here he was unable to eat everything he'd been given. Henderson noticed him staring. The old rancher's face softened. "You okay, son? Eat up. There's plenty more." Plenty more. Those words seemed to sum up everything about America. There was always plenty more. More food, more equipment, more electricity, more of everything. While Germany scraped by on less and less rationing, everything down to nothing, America had abundance so vast they took it for granted and wasted the excess. Henderson sat down beside William on the grass. He was quiet for a moment, then spoke. "My boy Billy was about your age when he died, Anzio, fighting your army." William's throat closed. He didn't know what to say. "But you're just a kid too," Henderson continued. "Didn't start this war. Hell, you were probably barely old enough to shave when it began." He sighed. War makes enemies out of people who'd otherwise have no quarrel. Billy understood that. He wrote me a letter before he died, said they were fighting for something bigger than hate, fighting to protect the things we love back home. The old man stood up, brushed off his pants. "Anyway, finish your lunch. We've got work to do." William sat there with half-eaten chicken and pie on his plate, and he felt something shift inside him. This man had lost his son to German soldiers. He had every right to hate, every right to be cruel, but instead he showed kindness. He saw William as a person, not just an enemy. It was incomprehensible through the lens of Nazi teaching, but it was happening right in front of William's eyes. That evening back at camp, William lay in his bunk and thought about everything he'd seen. The waste, the abundance, the kindness from a man who'd lost his son. The contradictions kept piling up until they became impossible to ignore. But speaking those thoughts aloud was dangerous. Volker was always watching. The camp infrastructure revealed American capabilities in ways that were impossible to deny. Every barracks had electric lights that worked 24 hours a day. Flip a switch and the bulb came on. Every single time. No blackouts, no brownouts, no rationed electricity. In Munich, the power had been out more often than on since the Allied bombing campaigns intensified. Factories stood dark. Homes sat in blackness. But here in a prison camp in Colorado, electricity was so abundant they didn't even think about it. Twice a week, the prisoners were allowed hot showers. There was a communal shower building with boilers that heated the water. William stood under the spray and felt the heat soak into his skin. The temperature was almost too hot, burning in the best way. Steam filled the room, echoing with the sound of water hitting tile. The smell of real soap made from lye and fat, the clean scent of actual hygiene. He could feel dirt washing away warmth spreading through his muscles. In Normandy, he'd gone months without a proper bath. The stench of unwashed bodies, mud, blood, and death had been constant. In Munich now, his mother and sister were lucky to get cold water once a week. But here, prisoners of war got hot showers twice weekly with unlimited time. The plumbing worked. Toilets flushed when you pulled the chain. Water swirled and waste disappeared into pipes that actually functioned. German cities had sewage systems that overflowed from bomb damage and neglect. Here, everything just worked. There was a library in camp, over 2,000 books, many of them in German. Prisoners could check them out and read during free time. William discovered books on American history, translations of the Constitution, works on democracy and individual rights. Knowledge that had been forbidden under Nazi rule was freely available here. He read late into the night by electric light, absorbing ideas about human dignity and self-governance that contradicted everything he'd been taught. The American system of government explained in clear prose. The concept that all men were created equal, that they had inherent rights, not granted by the state, but recognized by it. The idea that government existed to serve the people, not the other way around. These were revolutionary concepts to a young man raised under fascism. William began to understand that the abundance he saw everywhere wasn't just material, it was philosophical. A system built on freedom and human potential produced more than a system built on control and conformity. The evidence was overwhelming. December 22nd arrived cold and clear. Evening roll call at 6 p.m. The prisoners assembled in formation on the frozen parade ground, breath visible in clouds. Colonel Harrison, the camp commander, stood at the front. He was 48 West Point, educated, stern, but fair. A translator stood beside him. Harrison's voice carried across the silent ranks. The translator repeated his words in German. Gentlemen, Christmas is in 3 days. On December 25th, we will host a special dinner for all prisoners. A traditional American Christmas feast. Turkey with all the traditional accompaniments. We will decorate the mess halls. Our officers will join you as our guests. Consider this our gift to you. We may be on opposite sides of this war, but it is still Christmas. That means something. A ripple of confused murmuring went through the formation. William's heart started pounding. Christmas dinner with the Americans, what did that mean? Different reactions spread through the assembled prisoners like fire through dry grass. Volker's faction looked suspicious and angry. The uncertain majority looked confused and cautiously hopeful. The secret doubters had quiet excitement in their eyes, quickly hidden. After dismissal, Volker gathered his faction in the barracks. William hung back near his bunk, pretending to organize his belongings while he listened. Volker's voice was hard and certain. This is propaganda, pure and simple. They will photograph us looking grateful and use it against Germany. They want to break our will, make us soft. It's a psychological tactic. Murmurs of agreement from his loyalists. We will eat their food, Volker continued. We need our strength, but we show no gratitude, no smiles, no thanks. We give them nothing they can use. And anyone who forgets this, anyone who acts grateful or friendly, anyone who betrays the Führer even with a smile. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Will answer to me personally. We are still German soldiers. We maintain discipline. We remember our duty. Understood. The murmur of agreement was louder now. 50 men or more pledging loyalty to the dead ideology. William lay in his bunk that night, unable to sleep. Tomorrow was December 23rd, the day after Christmas Eve, and then the dinner. He didn't know what to expect. Part of him was excited despite himself. Christmas dinner, real Christmas, like before the war. The smells, the decorations, the sense of something sacred and special. But Volker's threat was real. Showing gratitude could get him beaten or worse. The choice was forming in William's mind. Hide his feelings and stay safe, or honor the truth he was beginning to see and accept the consequences. He thought about his mother and sister in Munich, cold and hungry. He thought about the abundance here, the waste, the contradictions. He thought about Henderson losing his son, but still showing kindness. He thought about Dr. Morrison giving him anesthesia for 7 stitches. He thought about hot showers and electric lights and libraries full of forbidden knowledge. The lies were becoming unbearable. December 23rd dawned in gray and cold. The smell of baking began to drift from the camp kitchens. William could smell bread, that yeasty wheat smell of real dough rising. By afternoon, the smell of roasting turkey joined it. Rich, savory, the scent of meat being prepared with care and abundance. The prisoners couldn't escape it. The smells filled the camp, a constant reminder of what was coming. Volker's men grew more tense and paranoid. They watched everyone, constantly looking for signs of weakness or gratitude or betrayal. The atmosphere in the barracks was electric with tension. On Christmas Eve, the decorating began. Prisoners on kitchen detail came back with reports. Pine boughs were being hung everywhere. The Americans had cut fresh pine from the mountains, and the sharp, clean smell of resin and needles filled the mess hall. White tablecloths were being spread on every table. Paper decorations handmade by American soldiers were being strung up. Red, white, and blue chains, stars and snowflakes and bells. It was being transformed into something that looked like Christmas. Real Christmas. The kind William remembered from childhood before the war destroyed everything. That night, William couldn't sleep. He lay in the darkness, listening to wind howl across the Colorado prairie and men breathing around him. Tomorrow was Christmas. Tomorrow something would happen that would change everything. He could feel it coming like a storm on the horizon. He didn't know yet that it would break him open and remake him, that it would shatter 9 years of lies in a single evening, that the simple act of an enemy officer sitting across a table and asking about his mother would destroy the wall of propaganda more effectively than any argument or evidence ever could. William Becker lay awake on Christmas Eve 1944, a prisoner of war in a foreign land, waiting for a moment that would define the rest of his life. The smell of roasting turkey reached even his barracks. The scent of pine and cinnamon and coffee. The smell of abundance and kindness and something he had almost forgotten existed. The smell of hope. Christmas morning, 1944. William woke to a smell so overwhelming it seemed impossible. Roasting turkey. The scent filled the barracks, permeating everything. His blankets, his clothing, the very air he breathed. Rich and savory, the smell of meat being prepared with care and abundance. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Inside, the coal stove kept them warm, and that magnificent smell promised something William couldn't quite name. 6 in the morning. The barracks stirred slowly. Men sat up in their bunks, sniffing the air, looking at each other with confused hope in their eyes. It was Christmas Day. 18 months ago, William had been in Munich with his family. 2 Christmases ago, there had been a goose and his mother's potato dumplings and candlelight reflecting off the ornaments his grandmother had collected over 50 years. That world felt like it belonged to someone else. The morning routine was different today. The guards who came through for count were relaxed, almost friendly. One sergeant, an older man with gray hair, wished them Merry Christmas in careful German. His accent was terrible, but his smile was genuine. William didn't know how to respond. Volker's men glared at the guard with undisguised hatred. Breakfast was special, real eggs not powdered. William watched them being prepared in the mess hall kitchen. The cooks cracked shells and yolks broke golden yellow into hot pans. But it was the bacon that stopped him in his tracks. The bacon sizzled in enormous skillets. Dozens of strips curling as the fat rendered out. The sound filled the kitchen, the crackling, popping symphony of cooking meat. The smell was incredible. Smoky, salty, meaty. It cut through every other scent and demanded attention. William stood in line watching the bacon cook, watching the edges darken and crisp, watching grease pool in the pans. When the server put 3 strips on his plate, William carried his tray to a table and just stared at them for a moment. The strips were thick, not the thin speck he remembered from Germany. American bacon is substantial and generous. He picked one up with his fingers. It was hot, and grease marked his skin. He bit down. The crunch was audible. The strips shattered between his teeth, and then flavor exploded in his mouth. Salt, fat, smoke, richness. Grease coated his tongue and lips. He closed his eyes. His mother hadn't tasted bacon in 2 years. This single strip probably represented more calories than she would eat today. Coffee came in metal cups poured from enormous pots. Real American coffee, dark roast, strong enough to wake the dead. The smell was bold, slightly bitter, promising alertness and warmth. William wrapped both hands around the hot cup and felt heat seep into his palms. He drank it black. The liquid was hot and bitter and perfect, spreading warmth from his throat down into his stomach. Around him, men ate in a strange silence. This was Christmas morning, breakfast, in a prison camp, and they were eating better than they had eaten in years. Better than their families were eating. The contradiction was painful. After breakfast, 6 hours stretched ahead before the Christmas dinner at 1 p.m. Time crawled. William tried to read but couldn't focus. He tried to write in his hidden diary, but the words wouldn't come. He just lay in his bunk thinking about what was coming, feeling Volker's eyes on him from across the barracks. At 11:30, Volker gathered his faction. They met in the corner near the latrine, voices low but urgent. William was close enough to hear. Today is the test. Volker's voice was hard as iron. They will try to break us with kindness. It's the oldest trick. Make the prisoner comfortable, make him grateful, and he forgets who he is. He forgets his duty. One of the younger loyalists spoke up. But Sergeant, the food really is good. The treatment really is fair. Maybe, Volker cut him off with a look that could have drawn blood. Maybe nothing. We are German soldiers. We serve the Führer. These Americans want to photograph us smiling, use it for propaganda, show the world that Germans are weak and grateful to their captors. We will not give them that satisfaction. He swept his gaze across the assembled men. You will eat their turkey. You will fill your bellies. We need our strength, but you will show no gratitude, no smiles, no fraternization. And if I see any man in this camp thanking these people, if I see any man acting friendly with the enemy, if I see any betrayal of Germany, no matter how small, he paused. That man will learn what happens to traitors. We have ways. The guards don't see everything. William felt Volker's eyes land on him specifically. The big man crossed the barracks and stood over William's bunk. He leaned down close. Especially you, Becker. I've been watching you. I see the doubt in your eyes. I see you thinking thoughts you shouldn't think. Today will reveal who you really are. Choose carefully. William's mouth was dry. I'm loyal to Germany, Sergeant. We'll see. Volker straightened. We'll all see. Before we continue to what happened that Christmas afternoon, the moment that would change everything for William and thousands of others, I want to hear from you. If you served during this era, or if your parents or grandparents shared stories about German prisoners in America during the war, please share those memories in the comments below. These personal histories connect us to what really happened beyond what history books capture. They matter. Your stories matter. Now let me tell you about the moment that shattered 9 years of propaganda in a single afternoon. 12:30 p.m. The prisoners were called to the mess hall in groups of 500. William's group was in the third wave. They lined up outside the building in the bitter cold, stamping their feet, breath hanging in white clouds. The smell coming from inside was overwhelming. Turkey and sage and butter and cinnamon and pine. The doors opened. William stepped inside and his breath caught in his throat. The transformation was complete and it was beautiful. Pine boughs hung from every rafter. Fresh cut from the Colorado mountains, they filled the enormous room with the smell of forest and resin and Christmas. The sharp, clean scent of evergreen needles mixed with the rich smell of cooking food and created something that reached into William's chest and squeezed. White tablecloths covered every long table. William had eaten in this mess hall for 6 weeks and the tables had always been bare metal. Now they were dressed like someone's dining room at home. Clean white fabric that looked crisp and fresh. Paper decorations hung everywhere. Stars cut from red and blue paper. Snowflakes made from folded white paper, each one unique. Bells and chains and garlands, all handmade by American soldiers who had spent their free time crafting decorations for enemy prisoners. The care and effort that represented was staggering. Electric lights had been strung overhead. Not the harsh single bulbs that normally lit the room, but strings of smaller lights that glowed warm yellow and cast a gentle radiance over everything. The effect was magical. The whole space looked warm and golden and safe. At each place setting sat a real plate. Not a mess tin, not a tray, an actual china plate with a folding napkin beside it. Real silverware, a water glass, everything set properly the way you would set a table for welcome guests. In the center of each table sat tea-light candles in glass holders. The flames flickered, gently adding to the warm glow. Safety had been considered. The holders were metal-based, so they couldn't tip, but the symbolism was powerful. Candlelight at Christmas, light in darkness, hope. The radio in the corner played Christmas carols, American versions with English words, but the melodies were familiar. Silent Night, Oh Come All Ye Faithful, songs that transcended language and nationality. Songs about peace and goodwill and things that felt very far away from the reality of war. From the kitchen came the sound of organized chaos, pots clanging, ovens opening and closing. Commands shouted in English. The clatter and bustle of a massive operation preparing to feed thousands of men. William walked to his assigned table in a daze. Around him, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Older men had tears in their eyes they were trying to hide. Younger men stood frozen, overwhelmed by memory and emotion. This looked like Christmas, real Christmas. The kind they remembered from childhood, from before everything broke and burned. This looked like home. William sat down at a table with 11 other men from his barracks. 4 were Volker's loyalists, faces hard and suspicious. 5 were uncertain like William. 2 were secret doubters, and he could see quiet joy in their eyes quickly hidden. 3 tables away, Volker sat with his hardcore faction radiating anger and control. The servers brought food on enormous platters. They were American soldiers, enlisted men with friendly faces carrying the meal. Like it was an honor, William watched them approach his table. The turkey came first. Each man received 2 thick slices, white meat and dark meat both. The skin was golden brown and crispy. When the server set the plate down, William could hear the faint crackle of that skin. Steam rose from the fresh carved meat. Juice pooled on the plate, rich and savory. The smell was incredible. Roasted poultry herb rubbed perfectly cooked. It smelled like abundance and care and tradition. It smelled like everything the war had taken away. Mashed potatoes came next, not a modest portion, but a mountain. At least a cup and a half whipped smooth without lumps. Real cream had been added. William could see it in the texture, the richness, the way the potatoes held their shape. A pat of butter melted on top, creating a golden pool. Gravy was ladled over both the turkey and potatoes. Thick and brown and glossy, it cascaded in a rich stream. The smell of meat drippings and flour and seasoning rose with the steam. This was gravy made from actual turkey fat and pan juices, not some thin substitute. Stuffing filled another section of the plate. Bread cubes studded with celery and onion and herbs, golden brown at the edges where it had crisped. The smell of sage and thyme and butter was distinct and powerful. Cranberry sauce sat in a bright red mound. It still held the shape of the can it had come from, ridged and jiggly. This was an American tradition William didn't understand, but the sweet tart smell cut through the savory richness of everything else. Green beans with slivered almonds. William didn't recognize the nuts, but the beans glistened with butter, and the strange pale slivers added texture and interest. Sweet potatoes topped with marshmallows. Another American tradition that seemed bizarre to German sensibilities, but the smell was sweet and inviting. The marshmallows had been broiled until brown and slightly crispy. 2 fresh rolls sat on the side of the plate, warm, yeasty, begging to be torn open. Butter pats accompanied them, real butter soft enough to spread easily. William stared at his plate. This was more food than he had seen in one place in 3 years. More food than he might have eaten in a week during the final year of the war. The portions were feast-sized, the kind of generous serving you gave to welcome guests, to family, to people you cared about. But he was a prisoner, an enemy soldier, and he was being given a feast. Around the room, 8,500 German prisoners sat with full plates in front of them. Nobody was eating yet. They were waiting. Waiting for something, for the trick to be revealed, for the cameras to come out, for permission, for something to make sense of this impossible generosity. William looked at Volker 3 tables away. The big sergeant's face was stone, but his eyes burned with barely controlled rage. Then the doors opened again. Complete silence fell over the enormous room. Every head turned. American officers walked in. Not guards, not enlisted men, officers. Colonel Harrison led them. Behind him came 15 company commanders, all in dress uniforms, clean and pressed, ribbons on their chests marking battles and service. They carried plates in their hands, the same food the prisoners had been given. They weren't here to supervise. They weren't here to watch. They were here to eat. The officers walked to tables throughout the room. They looked for empty seats, and they sat down. Right next to German prisoners. The same tables, the same benches, no separation, no barrier. Officers eating with enlisted enemy soldiers as if this was normal, and as if this was right. One officer approached William's table. He was young for a captain, maybe 28. Brown hair cut military short, blue eyes that looked tired but kind. He carried his plate in one hand. He scanned the table, found the empty seat directly across from William, and made eye contact. The officer nodded, simple greeting. Not hostile, not overly friendly, just human acknowledgement. Then he sat down, 3 feet away from William, close enough to touch. William's heart hammered so hard he thought everyone could hear it. An American officer was sitting across from him. This man had fought against Germany, might have killed German soldiers, might have been at Normandy or Sicily or any of the battles where William's countrymen died. And now he was sitting down to eat Christmas dinner with the enemy. The officer picked up his fork and began to eat. Casual, natural, like this was something he did every day. Around the room, other officers were doing the same. Sitting, eating, existing in the same space as the men they had captured. Nobody had cameras, no propaganda officers circulated taking photographs. No journalists scribbled notes. This wasn't for show. This wasn't staged. This was simply American officers choosing to share a meal with enemy prisoners on Christmas Day because they believed something about human dignity that transcended the war. William's hands shook as he picked up his own fork. The officer across from him was halfway through his turkey. William cut a piece and brought it to his mouth. The meat was tender, juicy, perfectly seasoned. The flavor was rich and satisfying. He swallowed and felt warmth spread through him. The officer looked up and caught William staring. For a long moment, they made eye contact. Then the officer spoke. His voice was quiet, careful. "Do you speak English?" William's throat felt tight. He could feel Volker's eyes burning into his back from 3 tables away. Speaking to an American officer was dangerous. Fraternizing was betrayal. But something in this man's face made William answer. "Little." His voice came out rough. Small English." The officer nodded. "Where are you from?" "München." William stumbled over the German pronunciation, then tried the English. "Munich." "Beautiful city." The officer's face was gentle. "I saw photographs before the war. The architecture is incredible." William was surprised. This enemy officer knew Munich, had studied it, cared about its beauty. The officer continued, "You have family there?" William nodded, unable to speak. "Mother, father, brothers, or sisters?" William managed to answer. "Mother, sister." He made a gesture across his throat, the universal sign for death. "Father." The officer's face changed. Genuine sadness crossed it. "I'm sorry." Sorry. An American officer expressing sympathy for a German father's death. A father who died fighting America's allies. The cognitive dissonance made William's head spin. Everything he'd been taught said Americans would celebrate German deaths. But this man's sorrow looked real. The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke again, his voice even softer. "My brother died. Omaha Beach, June 6th. William understood enough. Omaha Beach, D-Day, the invasion. His eyes went wide. This man's brother had been killed at Normandy fighting the German army. Fighting soldiers like William. And now he was sitting here eating dinner with the enemy 3 feet away. The officer continued. He was 19 years old. He paused, met William's eyes. "Same as you." The parallel hit William like a physical blow. 19 years old. The officer's brother and William the same age, born the same year, growing up in different countries, with different flags and different languages, but fundamentally the same. Young men who became soldiers because their countries went to war. One died. One survived and became a prisoner. The randomness of it was staggering. The officer asked another question. His voice was gentle but direct. "What did they tell you about Americans before you were captured?" William hesitated. This was dangerous territory, but something about this moment, this conversation, this man's face, made him want to answer honestly. He looked over at Volker. The sergeant was watching, face dark with fury. William looked back at the officer and whispered, "They say barbarians, criminals, torture prisoners." The officer's smile was sad. Not angry, just sad, like he'd expected this answer. "And what do you think now?" William couldn't answer. His throat closed up. Tears threatened. This man whose brother died at Omaha Beach was asking what William thought of Americans. This man who had every right to hate, every justification for cruelty, was sitting across from him, asking about his mother and treating him like a human being. And in that moment, 9 years of propaganda crumbled like ash. William had been taught that Germans were the master race, superior in every way, that their enemies were subhuman mongrels who deserved no respect. But this American officer showed more humanity in 5 minutes than William's own officers had shown in 5 years of service. The tears came. William couldn't stop them. He grabbed his napkin and tried to hide his face, but the sobs shook his shoulders. He was crying in front of an enemy officer in a room full of prisoners with Volker watching, and he couldn't stop. The officer didn't mock him, didn't tell him to be strong, didn't embarrass him. He just spoke quietly. "It's okay. It's Christmas. We remember the people we've lost. That's what today is for." He pushed a clean napkin across the table. William took it, wiped his eyes, tried to get control of himself, but something had broken inside him. Some wall that had been built up over years of Hitler youth meetings and propaganda films and officers' speeches. It shattered, and behind it was the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. His enemies had shown him more dignity than his own government ever had. The people he'd been taught to hate treated him better than the people he'd been taught to serve. The lie became unbearable. The officer gave William a moment to compose himself, then spoke again. "My name is Captain James Sullivan, from Boston." William managed to respond. William Becker." "It's good to meet you, William." Sullivan's voice held no irony, no sarcasm. He meant it. They finished their meal in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not hostile, not awkward, just two men eating together, sharing space, acknowledging each other's humanity. Throughout the room, similar conversations were happening. Officers and prisoners talking, language barriers overcome through gestures and simple words and shared humanity. At some tables, men were showing photographs. At others, they were trying to communicate through drawing. At still others, they sat in companionable silence, just existing together. Volker's faction ate in grim, furious silence. But even they couldn't deny what was happening. The kindness was real. The food was real. The dignity was real. And no amount of ideology could explain it away. Dessert came on smaller plates. Pie. 3 types. Apple pumpkin and cherry. William received apple pie. A full slice, generous and still warm from the oven. The crust was golden brown and flaky. When his fork cut through it, the pastry cracked with an audible sound. The filling inside was cinnamon apples steaming slightly, the fruit soft and sweet. The smell was incredible. Cinnamon, nutmeg, butter, sugar. The taste of comfort in home and tradition. William took a bite and closed his eyes. The sweetness, the spice, the texture of tender fruit and crisp crust. It reminded him of his mother's Apfelkuchen, the apple cake she used to make for Christmas when he was a child. Before the uniforms, before the war, before everything changed. Coffee came in fresh pots. Sullivan poured for both of them from the pot on their table. Real American coffee, the best quality, strong and hot and abundant. He poured William's cup first, then his own. The simple act of an enemy officer serving a German prisoner felt symbolic in ways William couldn't fully articulate. Sullivan raised his coffee cup. To absent friends, William understood. He raised his own cup, and to peace, Sullivan added quietly, someday. They drank together, honoring their dead. Patrick Sullivan and Wilhelm Becker Sr. killed on opposite sides of the same terrible war. Father and brother gone, but not forgotten. For a moment, the war felt very far away. When the meal ended, the officers began to leave. Sullivan stood and extended his hand across the table. William stood too uncertain. They shook hands. Sullivan's grip was firm, equal, respectful. Take care of yourself, William. William found his voice, in English carefully pronounced. Thank you, Captain, for everything. Sullivan smiled. There was sadness in it, but also something else. Hope, maybe. Merry Christmas. He walked away. William sat back down slowly, feeling like the world had shifted on its axis. Then Volker stood up. His voice carried across the room. He was shouting in German, his face red with rage. This was propaganda, a trick. They bought you with turkey and lies. You shame the Führer. You shame Germany. You are weak. All of you are weak. But something had changed. An older German sergeant stood up at his table. His voice was calm but firm. We ate together as men. That is all. Another prisoner spoke up. My wife starves in Hamburg. I ate better here today than she will eat this year. That's not propaganda. That's fact. Another. The Americans treat us like human beings. The Reich treated us like ammunition to be expended. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Hundreds of voices. Men who had been uncertain or doubting were finding courage to speak truth. The evidence was overwhelming. The kindness had been real. The abundance was real. And 9 years of Nazi lies couldn't stand against the reality they'd just experienced. Volker looked around wildly. His authority was crumbling. The men were no longer afraid. Truth was more powerful than threats. American guards moved in calmly, asking everyone to return to their barracks. Their voices were professional, not angry. They didn't need force. The prisoners filed out quietly, many of them helping to clean tables, talking in low voices with the guards who'd served them. Volker stormed out with 20 or 30 of his most loyal followers. But hundreds stayed behind, helping, talking, acknowledging the Americans who had shown them such unexpected kindness. William walked back to the barracks in a daze. He knew what was coming. Volker would make him pay for crying, for talking to Sullivan, for showing gratitude. The beating would come tonight after lights out. He knew this with certainty, but he also knew something else. The truth he'd discovered was worth the price. That evening, William lay in his bunk, writing in his hidden diary by the light of a small candle. His hands shook slightly, but his resolve was firm. He wrote about the dinner, about Sullivan asking about his mother, about a man who lost his brother choosing kindness over hate, about the moment when 9 years of lies became unbearable. He wrote, "Today, an enemy showed me more humanity than my own officers did in 5 years. Captain Sullivan's brother died at Omaha Beach, fighting men like me. He could have hated me. He had earned that right. But he chose kindness instead. He chose to see me as a person, not just an enemy. Everything I was taught was a lie." At 10 p.m. the lights went out. William lay in the darkness waiting. He heard heavy footsteps approaching his bunk. Volker's voice was soft and deadly. "You cried. You thanked them. You betrayed Germany." 4 men grabbed William and dragged him to the latrine, away from the guard's sight. Volker's fists came fast and brutal. Pain exploded in William's ribs, his eye, his jaw. He tasted blood. They kicked him when he fell. The agony was sharp and overwhelming. But William didn't fight back. He accepted it. The physical pain was nothing compared to the weight of truth he had been carrying. He'd made his choice. He would rather suffer for truth than live comfortably with lies. "You're a traitor," Volker spat. William looked up through his swelling eye. His voice came out thick with blood, but steady. "No, I'm just done with lies." More blows came, then flashlights. American guards bursting in, shouting, pulling Volker off. Colonel Harrison arrived within minutes. Harrison interviewed William through a translator. William refused to identify his attackers. Prisoner code. You didn't inform even on men you hated. But Harrison knew anyway. This wasn't the first beating Volker had ordered. By morning, Volker and his hardcore faction were moved to an isolation compound. 200 men separated from the general population. The message was clear. Violence would not be tolerated. Dr. Morrison treated William's injuries. X-rays showed a broken rib. Morrison wrapped it carefully, gave him pain medication, and looked at him with something like respect. "You stood up for what you believed. That takes real courage." William thought about Captain Sullivan, about choosing kindness when hate would be easier, about standing for truth when lies were safer. That was real courage. That was real strength. In the days after Christmas, the camp transformed. 7,000 prisoners now openly questioned the Nazi ideology. They talked freely about what they'd experienced. They shared observations. They admitted doubts. The Christmas dinner had been a turning point, a moment when reality shattered propaganda so completely that denial became impossible. William became a quiet leader among the younger prisoners. He told his story again and again, about Sullivan, about Henderson the rancher, about Dr. Morrison, about the choice between comfortable lies and difficult truth. Sullivan visited William weekly after that. He brought books on American history and democracy. He helped William improve his English. A friendship formed between them. Proof that enemies could become something else. Proof that reconciliation was possible. The war ground on through the winter. News came through the radio, Germany retreating on all fronts, the Battle of the Bulge failing, Soviet forces closing on Berlin from the east, American forces crossing the Rhine from the west. The end was approaching. William thought about his mother and sister in Munich, living through the final collapse. He thought about the abundance here in Colorado, the waste he'd seen, the impossible gap between American prosperity and German desperation. He thought about how completely he'd been lied to. And he thought about Christmas Day 1944, when an enemy officer sat across from him and asked about his mother and the world as he'd known it ended. That was the moment everything changed, not with violence or argument or force, but with simple human kindness, with the choice to treat an enemy as a person, with turkey and pea and a handshake that said, "You matter, your humanity matters, even here, even now, even though we're at war." William Becker would remember that lesson for the rest of his life, and he would teach it to anyone who would listen. The Barbarians, it turned out, had never been the Americans at all. May 8th, 1945. The announcement came at morning roll call. Colonel Harrison stood before the assembled prisoners with a translator at his side. His face was serious but not unkind. The words he spoke would change everything. "Gentlemen, as of today, May 8th, 1945, Germany has surrendered unconditionally. Adolf Hitler is dead. The Third Reich is finished. The war in Europe is over." Silence fell across 8,500 men like a blanket of fresh snow. Complete in absolute silence. William stood in formation and felt the words hit him in waves. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed after 12. Around him, men processed this information in different ways. Some began to cry, not from shame but from relief so profound it overwhelmed them. The killing would stop. The dying would stop. Whatever came next, at least the war itself was over. Some just stared in shock, unable to believe it was real. Some sat down suddenly as their legs gave out, the weight of 5 years of war finally lifting. From the isolated compound where Volker's faction was kept, shouting erupted. Lies allied propaganda, Germany will never surrender. But their voices sounded hollow even to themselves. The evidence was overwhelming. The war was over and they had lost. William felt overwhelming relief mixed with grief. Relief that the killing would stop. Grief for what Germany had become, for what had been done in its name, for the lies that had poisoned an entire generation. And worry, deep gnawing worry for his mother and sister in Munich. What had happened to them during the final collapse? Were they even alive? The camp atmosphere shifted immediately. Guards relaxed. They were no longer guarding enemy combatants, just displaced persons waiting to go home. Prisoners were allowed more freedom of movement. Work programs expanded. Education classes were offered. English lessons, American history, vocational skills. The focus changed from imprisonment to preparation for whatever came next. But repatriation would take time. Millions of displaced people were scattered across Europe. The infrastructure was destroyed. The process would be slow and complicated. Some prisoners left in late 1945, many remained into 1946. William's turn wouldn't come until November 1946, more than a year after the war ended. During those long months of waiting, William continued working at Henderson's ranch. He saved every penny of his wages. He studied English seriously with Sullivan's help. The captain visited twice a week now, bringing books and conversation. Their relationship had deepened beyond mentor and student into genuine friendship. Proof that reconciliation was real and lasting. William wrote letters to Munich but received no responses. The mail system was destroyed. He had no way of knowing if his mother and sister had survived. The uncertainty was torture. He lay awake at night imagining scenarios. Best case, worst case, everything in between. The not knowing was almost worse than any definite answer would have been. Sullivan tried to help. He made inquiries through military channels, but information from occupied Germany was scarce and unreliable. All he could tell William was that Munich had been heavily bombed, but not completely destroyed. Whether William's family had survived remained unknown. In those months, something else happened that shattered what remained of William's worldview. The full horror of the concentration camps was revealed. Allied forces had discovered them in the spring of 1945 as they advanced into Germany. Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, names that would live in infamy. The photographs began circulating in summer. Film footage followed. Testimony from survivors. Physical evidence that could not be denied. Colonel Harrison made the decision to show this material to the prisoners. In July 1945, he assembled them in the mess hall and screened film footage. He believed they needed to see, needed to understand what had been done in Germany's name. The lights dimmed. The projector whirred. Images appeared on the makeshift screen. What William saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Piles of bodies, mountains of them. Human beings reduced to skeletal remains stacked like cordwood. The living looked like walking corpses. Skin stretched over bones. Eyes huge in wasted faces. Survivors who weighed 70 pounds, 80 pounds. Adults who looked like children. Children who looked like ancient, withered things. Gas chambers. Ovens. The industrial machinery of mass murder. 6 million Jews. Millions of others. Roma. Homosexuals. Political prisoners. The disabled. Anyone the regime deemed undesirable. Exterminated with bureaucratic efficiency. William sat in that dark mess hall and felt his stomach heave. He ran outside and vomited in the dirt. Then he sat with his back against the building and cried. Great wrenching sobs that tore out of his chest. This was done in Germany's name. Men wearing the same uniform he had worn committed these atrocities. The government he had served, the leaders he had trusted, the ideology he had believed in, had produced this horror. Sullivan found him there an hour later, still crying. The captain sat down beside him in silence. What could be said? What words could possibly address something this evil? Finally, William spoke. His voice was raw. I wore that uniform. I believe those lies. I'm responsible. Sullivan's response was gentle but firm. You were a child when this started. They lied to you from the time you could understand words. You're not responsible for what they did. But I believe them because they were very good at lying and very good at punishing anyone who questioned. Sullivan paused. What matters now is what you choose to do with the truth. You can't change the past, but you can shape the future. You can make sure this never happens again. William wiped his eyes. How? By telling the truth, by teaching the next generation differently, by building a Germany that rejects everything the Reich stood for. Sullivan looked at him seriously. You're young, you'll help rebuild your country. What kind of Germany will you build? It was a question William would carry with him for decades. The months crawled by. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter. Finally, in November 1946, William's name appeared on the repatriation list. He was going home. 2 years after arriving in Colorado, 18 months after the war ended, he was finally going home. The day of departure, Sullivan came to see him off at the processing station. They stood on the platform where William had first arrived that frozen November morning 2 years earlier. So much had changed since then. William had arrived a frightened boy who believed the lies. He was leaving a young man who understood truth and its cost. Sullivan handed him a package wrapped in brown paper. Don't open it until you're on the ship. They shook hands. The handshake turned into a brief embrace. Two men who had been enemies becoming brothers. Sullivan's voice was thick with emotion. Remember what you learned here, William? I will never forget. You showed me what humanity looks like. You taught me that enemy can become friend. That truth is worth suffering for. Sullivan smiled, but his eyes were wet. Build a better Germany. I know you can do it. I'll try. For Patrick, for all of them. Sullivan nodded. They understood each other completely. Patrick Sullivan and all the boys who died on both sides, the waste, the tragedy, the hope that something better could be built from the ruins. They parted as friends. On the ship, William unwrapped Sullivan's gift. Inside was a pocket English dictionary. On the inside cover, Sullivan had written in careful script, "To William, may this help you build bridges instead of walls. Your friend, James Sullivan." There was also a baseball. Autographed, the signatures faded but readable. Sullivan had included a note. From a Red Sox game 1941. Last one I attended before the war. Teach German kids about baseball. It's about more than sports. It's about playing instead of fighting. William held the baseball in his hands and cried. He would keep these gifts for the rest of his life. They would sit on a shelf in every home he ever lived in, reminders of what was possible when people chose humanity over hatred. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks. The ship was crowded prisoners packed below deck, just like the journey to America. But this time they were heading home instead of into uncertainty. The mood was strange, excitement mixed with dread. Everyone knew Germany was destroyed. Nobody knew how bad it really was. William talked with other ex-prisoners during the voyage. Many had similar stories. Christmas dinners in their camps, kind treatment, American abundance, the cognitive dissonance of being treated better as prisoners than as soldiers serving the Reich. There was consensus. The experience had changed them. They would be voices for democracy in whatever Germany emerged from the ashes. As the ship approached Hamburg, William stood on deck watching the coastline appear. Smoke still rose from parts of the city. 18 months after the war ended, things were still burning. The skyline looked wrong. Jagged and broken, buildings that should have been there were just gone. His heart sank. This was home. This was what he was returning to. The ship docked in northern Germany at a port that had been partially destroyed and partially rebuilt. William walked down the gangway carrying his small bag of possessions. The contrast hit him immediately like a fist to the gut. The dock workers were skeletal, thin beyond anything William had seen even at the camp before the good food began. Their clothes were worn patched, made from whatever materials they could find. Many wore military coats that had been dyed to hide insignia because warm clothing was scarce and you used what was available. Everyone moved slowly, conserving energy because they didn't have enough food for quick movement. The buildings around the port showed bomb damage, even though the war had been over for a year and a half. Some walls had been repaired with whatever materials existed. Bricks of different colors, boards, sheet metal. Others still showed gaping holes. Rubble sat in enormous piles along the streets, pushed aside to clear pathways, but not removed because there was nowhere to take it and no equipment to move it. The faces. That's what struck William most. Every face he saw looked haunted, hollow, defeated. These were people who had lived through hell and survived, but carried the scars in their eyes. Before we continue to William's journey home and what he found in Munich, I want to ask you something. What traditional American values do you think are most important to preserve and pass on to the next generation? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one, and your perspectives matter. We're almost at the end of William's story, but the lessons he learned are timeless. Stay with me for just a few more minutes. William caught a train heading south toward Bavaria. The journey took 2 days because the railway system was damaged and trains ran on uncertain schedules. Tracks had been bombed, bridges destroyed. Everything was temporary repairs and makeshift solutions. The train stopped frequently, sometimes sitting for hours while crews cleared debris from the tracks or made repairs to the engine. William sat by a window and watched Germany pass by. The devastation was beyond anything he had imagined. Every city the train passed through showed massive destruction. Cologne's cathedral still stood defiant and beautiful, but everything around it was rubble. Frankfurt looked like the surface of the moon. Mannheim's industrial area was fields of twisted metal and burned buildings. Stuttgart was a ghost town of hollow structures. The people he saw at train stations looked desperate. Many women wore black. Widows. So many widows. Children with old faces and hungry eyes. Everyone thin, tired, hopeless. This was defeat, total and complete. William thought about Colorado, Henderson's ranch with 3 tractors and 2 trucks, the overflowing grain silos, the flour thrown away because it got moldy, the bacon at breakfast every day, the electricity that never failed, the hot showers twice a week, the abundance so vast that waste was casual. And now he was seeing Germany. Farmers working fields by hand because there was no fuel for machinery, even if machinery existed. Roads empty of vehicles. Everything powered by human and animal labor. The industrial gap between the two nations was so vast it seemed impossible they had ever been at war. How had Germany thought it could win? The delusion was staggering. The train finally reached the station nearest William's family village. From there he walked, 8 miles carrying his bag. The countryside showed less damage than the cities. Rural areas hadn't been strategic targets. But poverty was everywhere. Farms looked neglected, fields lay fallow, animals were scarce. The abundance of Henderson's ranch felt like a dream from another universe. William's feet knew the way home, even though his mind felt disconnected from reality. The village appeared ahead. Most buildings still stood. His family's house was there at the end of the lane. The roof had been patched with mismatched tiles. Windows were broken and repaired with boards and paper. Paint peeled from walls, but it was standing. He walked up the path and knocked on the door he used to just open and walk through. The door opened slowly. His mother stood there. Maria Becker was 45 years old but looked 65. She had been a beautiful woman, once blonde and strong, with laughter in her eyes. Now she was thin beyond recognition, bones visible through skin, hair gray where it had been golden, hands that shook constantly from malnutrition. But her eyes recognized him instantly. Wilhelm. She fell into his arms and they both cried. She weighed nothing. Holding her was like holding a bird hollow-boned and fragile. She smelled of lye soap and hunger and survival. He held her and felt his heart break. His sister Greta appeared in the doorway. 17 now. She had been 12 when he left, a child with braids and gap-toothed smile. Now she was nearly grown thin but strong, in the way people become when survival requires it. Her childhood had been stolen by war, but she was alive. They were both alive. That miracle was almost more than William could process. That first dinner home destroyed whatever romantic notions William had carried about returning to Germany. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten Christmas goose in 1939, when the world still made sense. But now the meal was watery soup, potato and cabbage, no meat. Dark bread so rough it hurt to chew sawdust mixed into the flour to stretch it further. Water to drink, no milk, no coffee, no tea, just water. The portions were small, 3 bowls. That was all the food there was. His mother apologized. I'm sorry it's not more, Wilhelm. I wish I could give you a proper welcome home meal. William's throat closed. He couldn't speak. Couldn't tell her that he had eaten better as a prisoner, that he had eaten turkey and bacon and pie while she starved, that Americans threw away more food in a day than this family saw in a month. The guilt was crushing. He ate the soup slowly, making it last. It was thin and tasteless and barely enough to take the edge off hunger. He thought about Christmas dinner 1944. The mountain of mashed potatoes, the thick gravy, the turkey with crispy skin, the apple pie, the coffee and real cream, the abundance so vast it seemed obscene now in comparison to this poverty. That night, William lay in his childhood bed. It was too short for him now. He had grown. The mattress was thin and lumpy. The room was cold because fuel was rationed so strictly that heat was a luxury save for the coldest nights. He could hear his mother and sister breathing in the next room, and he cried silently into his pillow. He had been safe while they suffered. He had been warm while they froze. He had been fed while they starved. The survivor's guilt was overwhelming, but underneath it was gratitude. Gratitude to the Americans who had kept him alive and healthy so he could come home to help his family survive. Gratitude for the kindness that had saved his life in more ways than one. And determination. He would rebuild. He would work. He would make it worth it somehow. The years after the war were hard beyond description. William found work as a carpenter's apprentice. Manual labor rebuilding destroyed buildings one brick at a time. Germany in those years was a broken nation trying to figure out how to exist again. The Nazi ideology lay exposed as the poison it had always been. The full horror of the camps was undeniable. The lies and propaganda looked ridiculous and evil in hindsight. William worked 12-hour days. He gave every penny he earned to his mother. Slowly, painfully slowly, things improved. The Marshall Plan began in 1948. American aid pouring into Germany. William noted the irony. The nation Germany had tried to destroy was rebuilding it, feeding its people, helping it recover. The generosity was staggering. He encountered other former prisoners from American camps during those years. They shared stories over beer when beer became available again, compared experiences, discussed the treatment they'd received. The consensus was universal. The American camps had changed them, shown them that democracy and human dignity produce better outcomes than fascism and hatred. Many became voices for the new Germany, speaking at schools, sharing their stories, teaching the next generation differently. In 1952, William married. Anna was a local girl herself, a survivor of the war years, someone who understood what he'd been through without needing explanation. They built a modest life together. Children came. First a son in 1954. William named him Patrick after Sullivan's brother. A daughter in 1956 named Maria after his mother. Another son in 1958 named James after Sullivan. As William's children grew, he told them about the war, about the Hitler Youth and the lies he'd believed, about Normandy and capture and the Atlantic crossing, and most importantly, about Christmas Day, 1944, when an American captain whose brother died at Omaha Beach sat across from him and asked about his mother. He taught them that ideology is cheap and easy, that real human decency is priceless and rare, that strength doesn't require cruelty, that you can be powerful and still choose kindness. The lessons Sullivan had taught him, he passed to his children. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, William exchanged letters with Sullivan. The captain had returned to Boston, married, had children of his own. He worked in construction management, rebuilding American cities that were growing and prospering. His letters painted pictures of abundance and optimism, America in its golden age. Germany recovered too. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s. By 1960, you could barely tell there had been a war. New buildings, new roads, prosperity returning, but the scars remained. The memories, the lessons learned in blood and suffering. In 1970, Sullivan traveled to Germany on business. He contacted William and they arranged to meet. 26 years after Christmas dinner, two old men now, or at least middle-aged. William was 45, Sullivan was 54. They met at the train station in Munich. Recognition was instant. They embraced like brothers, both crying, both laughing, holding on tight. The years fell away. They were young again for a moment, enemy and prisoner, captain and captive, and then just men who had chosen friendship over hatred. They walked through rebuilt Munich. Marienplatz Square was beautiful again, the medieval architecture restored. They sat at a cafe, ordered real coffee, and talked for hours. Sullivan marveled at Germany's recovery. William credited American aid, the Marshall Plan, the generosity of former enemies. "You chose to build instead of punish," William said. "You proved your values were real." Sullivan met his family, Anna and the three children, teenagers and young adults now. Patrick was 16 and played baseball in a local league. American sports had come to Germany. Sullivan held the baseball he'd given William 24 years earlier, faded and worn, but treasured. The symbolism made his eyes wet. "Your father was brave," Sullivan told the children. "At 19, he chose truth over lies when it was dangerous. That took more courage than any battle." The children were proud. They understood what their father had sacrificed and what he had become. Before Sullivan left, the two men stood at the rebuilt train station. "You showed me enemies could become brothers," Sullivan said quietly. "After Patrick died, I wanted to hate. You taught me that choosing kindness is strength." William shook his head. "You saved my life. Not just physically. You saved my soul from lies. Everything good in my life comes from that moment you asked about my mother." They embraced one final time. Sullivan returned to America, William to his rebuilt life. But the connection remained proof that reconciliation was real and lasting. 12 years later, in 1982, a documentary filmmaker came to interview German World War II veterans. William was 57, a retired carpenter with grandchildren. The filmmaker asked about moments that changed his understanding. William thought for a long moment. Then he spoke. His voice was measured and clear. "Christmas dinner, 1944, Camp Trinidad, Colorado. An American captain sat across from me. His brother died at Omaha Beach, killed by Germans like me. He could have hated me. He had every right. Instead, he asked about my mother." William's voice grew thick with emotion, but he continued. "He showed me that strength doesn't require cruelty, that you can be powerful and still choose kindness. I learned more about being truly human from my enemies than I ever learned from my own government." The filmmaker leaned forward. "What did that teach you?" "The Nazi regime taught us to hate, to see others as less than human. Captain Sullivan taught me that all people deserve dignity, regardless of nationality, uniform, or circumstance. That single Christmas dinner broke the ideology's power over my heart." William paused, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was strong and clear. "Ideology is cheap and easy. Anyone can hate. Anyone can dehumanize their enemies. Real human decency is priceless and rare. Choosing kindness when you don't have to, showing dignity to people who can't repay you, treating even your enemies as human beings. That's real strength. That's what makes a nation truly great." The filmmaker asked one more question. "What would you tell young people today?" William looked directly at the camera. His eyes were clear and certain. "Question what you're told about your enemies. Look for the humanity in every person. The greatest strength is choosing kindness when you don't have to. That's what Captain Sullivan taught me. That's what saved me. And that's what I'll teach my grandchildren." The interview ended. The filmmaker packed his equipment. But William sat for a long time after holding the baseball Sullivan had given him 40 years earlier, thinking about Christmas 1904, about turkey and pine boughs, and a conversation that changed his life, about the choice between hatred and humanity, and how that choice defined everything that followed. Sullivan died in 1985 at age 69. His widow wrote to William. The captain had left something in his will, his military service medal. The note with it said, "For William Becker, who showed me enemies can become friends, who taught me that the war was worth fighting because it protected the values that let us choose peace." William cried when he received it. He placed the medal on his shelf next to the baseball in the English dictionary. 3 objects, 3 symbols: friendship, play instead of war, bridges instead of walls. He continued speaking at schools about his experiences, telling the story of Christmas 1944 hundreds of times. The message never changed. Ideology is cheap. Humanity is priceless. Strength is choosing kindness. Truth is worth suffering for. William's children carried those lessons forward and taught them to their children. The legacy of one Christmas dinner spreading through generations. One moment of choosing humanity over hatred, creating ripples that touched hundreds of lives. The barbarians, it turned out, had never been the Americans at all. The real barbarism had been the ideology that taught young men like William to see humans as subhuman. That taught hatred as strength and cruelty as power. That turned neighbors into enemies and children into soldiers. Captain James Sullivan and the men of Camp Trinidad proved something profound. America's greatest strength was never its military might or industrial capacity, though both were overwhelming. Its greatest strength was the simple choice to treat all people as human beings, even enemies, even when no one was watching, even when there was no strategic advantage, even on Christmas Day 1944 in a prison camp in Colorado. That choice changed William Becker's life. Through him, it helped change Germany, one conversation at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one person choosing truth over lies, humanity over hatred, bridges over walls. 70 years later, the lesson remains. The greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in moments of unexpected kindness. Not with weapons, but with choices. Not by defeating enemies, but by transforming them into friends. One Christmas dinner, one question about a mother, one choice to see humanity in an enemy's eyes. That's all it took to begin breaking hatred's hold on a human heart. And that choice echoes still.